The moment I stepped through the glass doors of the Caldwell estate, I knew I had made either the best decision of my life or the worst. Diana Caldwell's eyes swept over me the way a hotel inspector surveys a budget motel slowly, methodically, cataloging every flaw. My simple sundress, my drugstore sandals, the small crossbody bag I'd had since college. She didn't say anything at first. She just tilted her head slightly toward my fiancé Ryan and murmured something behind her smile, the way people do when they want to be overheard just enough. She said I looked like someone who'd wandered in from the service entrance. And right then, I knew this weekend was going to be very, very interesting. My name is Nora Hayes. I'm 28 years old, and I have a confession to make. For the past 11 months, the man I agreed to marry has believed I work as a medical assistant at a busy urgent care clinic. He thinks I drive 40 minutes each way to answer phones, file charts, and hand doctors their tools. He thinks I share a one-bedroom apartment with a roommate because rent in this city is brutal. He thinks the nicest thing I own is the pea coat I wore on our third date. He's wrong about all of it. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I finished my residency at 26, one of the youngest in my program's history. I work 4 shifts a week at a level 1 trauma center, and what I make in a month would make most people do a double take. I have investments my financial advisor manages without me thinking about them. I have a condo I own outright that I keep deliberately sparse and quiet, because after 12-hour trauma shifts, the last thing I want is more noise. Ryan didn't know any of this, and I never corrected him. Before you assume the worst about me, let me explain. When Ryan and I met at a farmer's market 11 months ago, he asked what I did, and I said I worked in medicine. He smiled and nodded, and then his next question was whether I got to wear those cute scrub sets he'd seen advertised online. I laughed and said something vague about supportive roles. He filled in the blanks himself, and I let him. Because I learned something a long time ago from the only person who ever truly raised me. My grandmother, Ruth Hayes, took me in when I was 6 years old after my parents' accident. She lived in a small house in rural Ohio. She drove a pickup truck with a cracked dashboard. She clipped coupons and bought her clothes at the church rummage sale every spring. Every kid in my school knew we didn't have much. I knew it too. What I didn't know until the week after her funeral, when her attorney called me into his office, was that my grandmother had quietly built a real estate portfolio worth several $1 million over the course of her life. She'd started buying small rental properties in her 30s, reinvested every cent, and lived exactly as she always had because she said comfort never required an audience. She left everything to me, along with a letter. I still read it sometimes when I need to remember who I am. In it, she wrote that the truest measure of a person reveals itself only when they believe nothing is at stake, when they think you have nothing to offer, when they assume you are beneath their notice. That is when you learn what someone is actually made of. So when Ryan invited me to his family's lakeside estate for a long weekend, the weekend he hinted might be when things got more serious between us, I made a quiet decision. I would show up exactly as the woman his family expected. Modest clothes, practical car, humble answers, and I would watch. I would pay attention the way I pay attention in a trauma bay, where missing one detail can change everything. I wanted to know who the Caldwells really were when they thought no one important was watching. Now, before I go any further, if you're enjoying this so far, would you hit the like button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there? I genuinely love reading those. It means more than you know. Okay, back to the story. The Caldwell property sat on the eastern shore of a private lake in Connecticut. The driveway alone was longer than my grandmother's entire street. Iron gates opened automatically, as if the house had been expecting someone far more impressive than me. I pulled in with my 8-year-old Civic, which had a small crack in the passenger side mirror and a coffee ring on the center console that wouldn't fully come off. Ryan met me at the front steps. His smile was warm, but his eyes did something I hadn't seen before in all our months together. They traveled down to my car, down to my outfit, back up. A flicker of something crossed his face that disappeared almost before it registered. I filed that away. Diana Caldwell came down the steps herself, which I later understood was a performance. She wanted to set the tone before I got inside. She was elegant in the way that takes real effort to maintain pressed linen trousers, silk blouse, hair that moved as a single piece. She extended her hand with the kind of grip that communicates appraisal rather than welcome. She told me it was so nice to finally put a face to the name. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. Her eyes were not. Inside, the house was a study in curated wealth. Everything was tasteful, everything was expensive, and nothing felt lived in. It reminded me of a showroom, gorgeous from a distance, cold up close. Ryan's sister Brooke came downstairs 20 minutes late, which I suspected was intentional. She was 32, pretty in a high-maintenance way, wearing jewelry that announced itself from across the room. She looked at me the way you look at something you've ordered online that arrived smaller than expected. Her greeting was a single syllable, "Hey," delivered flat, like a door closing. Ryan's father, Gerald, was a different creature entirely. Big-shouldered, slow-moving, with the tired eyes of a man who had long since stopped trying to change things he couldn't control. He shook my hand and asked if I'd had trouble finding the place. It was the most genuine question anyone would ask me all weekend. There was one more person I hadn't expected, a man named Edward, introduced as a family friend and former business associate. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from watching rather than performing. When he shook my hand, something flickered in his expression, not recognition exactly, but something close to it. A question he wasn't ready to ask yet. I couldn't place it, but I noticed it. Lunch was served on the terrace overlooking the lake. The food was extraordinary. The conversation was a series of small, precisely aimed tests. Diana asked where I was from originally. I told her Ohio, which was true. She asked about my family. I told her my grandmother raised me. Also true. She asked what my grandmother had done for work. I said she'd managed some properties. Also true, if significantly understated. Brooke leaned in at that point. She asked what kind of properties. I said small residential rentals. Nothing glamorous. Brooke sat back with the satisfied expression of someone whose assumption had been confirmed. Diana asked about my work. I said I was in medicine, healthcare support. She nodded knowingly. She said that must be such demanding work, all those long hours for not very much in return. Her voice was designed to sound sympathetic. It didn't quite get there. Ryan said nothing to correct the condescension in his mother's tone. He just refilled his water glass. That was the second thing I filed away. Then Brooke brought up a name. She said it almost casually, the way you mention the weather when you're actually trying to start something. She said she'd run into Melissa Holt at the club last week, that she looked wonderful, that the Holt family's new development project was absolutely stunning. I watched Ryan's face. Something moved through it quickly, like a shadow crossing a wall. Diana picked it up immediately. She said Melissa's younger sister, Cassandra, was just exceptional. Sophisticated, well-traveled, deeply invested in the family's real estate business. She said Ryan and Cassandra had been close for years, hadn't they? Ryan said they were old friends. Diana smiled. She said Cassandra had always been such a natural fit. The Holts had been talking about a joint venture with the Caldwell Hotels Group. A real partnership, she said, the kind that grows from shared values and shared vision. The implication arrived fully formed. Cassandra was the right fit. I was not. I looked at the photographs arranged along the interior wall. I could see through the open terrace doors. Family gatherings, holidays, sailing trips. And in at least 3 of them, a dark-haired woman standing close to Ryan, laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his forearm like it belonged there. Cassandra. Diana caught me looking. She said nothing, but her satisfaction was visible the way expensive perfume is. You couldn't see it, but it filled the space. Gerald cleared his throat and asked if anyone wanted more iced tea. After lunch, Diana suggested the women take a walk down to the lake while the men talked. I recognized this for what it was, a chance to get me alone. I went. We walked along the dock, and Brooke asked me, with that particular sweetness that isn't sweet at all, whether I found it intimidating being around all of this. She gestured vaguely at the estate. She said some people found old family dynamics hard to navigate when they came from different backgrounds. I told her I'd always found it easier to let people show me who they were rather than trying to figure them out in advance. She blinked. It wasn't the answer she expected. She pivoted to talking about wedding venues, hypothetically, she said, just in case Ryan and I were ever heading in that direction. She mentioned a club her family belonged to, how there was a long waiting list, how you really needed the right connections to secure a date. She said it in a way that made clear she wasn't sure I had those connections. I smiled and said weddings were something I didn't think needed to be rushed. That evening, after dinner, Diana said she needed to speak to the caterer about tomorrow's arrangements, and everyone scattered naturally toward their rooms or the sitting room. I excused myself to find the bathroom. I took the long way back. The hallway off the east wing was quiet, lit by small wall sconces that made everything feel theatrical. I was passing the door to what I assumed was a study when I heard voices, low, urgent, unmistakably Diana's. I stopped. I know what it means to eavesdrop. I know it isn't clean or comfortable. But something in the sharpness of Diana's tone made my feet stop moving, the same instinct that makes you pause in the hallway of a hospital when something sounds wrong before you can identify what. She was saying they needed to move faster. She said Ryan was getting too attached, and that sentiment was going to cost them everything if they didn't redirect it. Brooke's voice. She said she couldn't believe Ryan had brought me here. She'd assumed it was just another distraction. Diana said this was different. She said Ryan had apparently told his friends about me, and that kind of visibility made things complicated. Then she said the thing that made my stomach drop. She said the Caldwell Hotels group was hemorrhaging money. 3 underperforming properties, a failed expansion into Miami, investors pulling out. She said the Holt family's investment, which was tied directly to a marriage between Ryan and Cassandra, was the only viable lifeline they had left. It wasn't about preference. It was about survival. Brooke said Ryan knew this. Diana said Ryan knew pieces of it. She said he'd agreed to keep things open with Cassandra while they worked out the details. She said once the deal was secured, they'd find a reason to end things with me. They'd manufacture something if they had to. She said it wouldn't be difficult. She said I seemed like the type who would be too embarrassed to make a scene. Then Brooke said something that I still hear sometimes when I need to remind myself why I did what I came to do. She said at least Ryan had chosen someone low-key. She said I was clearly just happy to be included. Grateful, she said. Like a golden retriever someone let inside. I stood very still in that hallway. My hands were steady. They're always steady. You can't do what I do for a living and let your hands shake when it matters. I walked to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists the way I do when I'm between critical cases and need to reset. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not look broken. I looked like someone who had just been handed exactly the information she needed. I'd come to this house to find out who the Caldwells really were. Now I knew. This wasn't just a family that looked down on people they considered beneath them. This was a calculated scheme. Ryan wasn't simply weak. Ryan was a participant. He had agreed to keep his options open with another woman while asking me to imagine a future with him. I dried my hands. I fixed my hair. And I walked back into the sitting room with a smile on my face because the most useful thing Diana Caldwell had just given me was the certainty that I wasn't leaving here until the full truth was in the light. The next morning I told Ryan I needed to make a few work calls and took a walk along the lake. What I actually did was make a series of very specific phone calls to people who owed me nothing, but called me back within the hour because of who my grandmother was and what her name still meant in certain rooms. My grandmother's name opened doors even now. She'd been quietly generous with people throughout her life, small investments in struggling local businesses, co-signing loans for families who couldn't get bank approval, showing up with cash when people needed it and never mentioning it again. Some of those people had gone on to build significant things, and some of those people knew exactly who the Caldwells were. One of those calls led me to Edward, the family friend who'd been watching me since the moment we met. I found out he had his own unresolved history with Gerald Caldwell, a business deal 15 years earlier in which he'd been pushed out of a partnership he'd helped build. He hadn't forgotten. When I reached out through a mutual contact, he responded within an hour. We met briefly by the water that afternoon while Ryan was in a call with his office. Edward told me he'd suspected something was off about this weekend from the moment Diana mentioned the Holt family at dinner. He said he'd also recognized my grandmother's name from Brooke's offhand comment about property management. He'd known her slightly, decades ago, before she sold her company. He said Ruth Hayes was one of the most quietly formidable people he'd ever encountered. I told him she was. He asked what I needed. I told him I wasn't interested in destruction. I was interested in truth. There was a difference, and I wanted to make sure he understood that before we went further. He said he understood perfectly. He said he'd been waiting 15 years for the right moment, and he had the documentation to prove it. Over the next 24 hours, I learned the full picture. The Caldwell Hotels Group wasn't just struggling, it was facing potential insolvency. 2 creditors had already filed notices. The Miami property was under investigation for permit irregularities. Gerald had known for over a year and had said nothing publicly, continuing to project an image of expansion and confidence while privately negotiating a bailout through the Holt family connection. I also learned something else. I borrowed Ryan's phone charger from the kitchen counter, and when I went to hand it back to him that evening, a message preview appeared on his screen before I could look away. The name at the top was Cassandra. The preview said, "Can't wait to finally tell people." I handed him his charger. He slipped the phone face down into his pocket. I asked how his calls had gone. He said fine. He asked if I was having a good time. I said the lake was beautiful. That night, I made 2 more calls. I packed my bag slowly and deliberately, and then I slept better than I had in weeks, because I had stopped wondering whether the version of Ryan I'd fallen for was real. I knew now that it wasn't. And clarity, even when it arrives as grief, is a kind of relief. Sunday morning. Diana had arranged an intimate brunch for close family and a handful of what she called key friends. I hadn't known this was planned. Ryan mentioned it over coffee like it was an afterthought. It wasn't. About 20 people arrived by 11, which is when I understood what this gathering actually was. Gerald stood near the fireplace with the Holt family attorney. Edward was positioned near the window, and we exchanged a brief glance. 2 of the guests were journalists who covered the business community. One woman I recognized from a real estate publication where my grandmother had once been profiled. Diana was orchestrating something. This brunch was a stage. I went upstairs, opened my bag, and changed my clothes. I had brought one thing from my real life, tucked into a garment bag I'd left in my car, a dress I'd worn to a medical conference gala in Chicago last spring. Dark blue, fitted, simple enough to look effortless and constructed well enough that anyone who knew fabric would stop. My grandmother's pearls at my throat, low heels, nothing excessive, nothing I needed to announce. I looked in the mirror. I looked like myself. For the first time all weekend, I looked exactly like myself. When I came downstairs, the room shifted in the quiet way rooms do when something unplanned enters them. I watched it happen, the subtle recalibration, the second glances, the small furrow appearing between Diana's carefully shaped brows. Gerald saw me first. His expression went from welcoming host to confused stranger in the span of 2 seconds. He said I looked wonderful. The word came out uncertain, like a test answer he wasn't sure was right. I thanked him and moved through the room. The woman from the real estate publication touched my arm near the coffee station. She said she thought she recognized me from somewhere. I told her my grandmother was Ruth Hayes. Her eyebrows rose. She said that Ruth Hayes had been someone she'd always wished she'd had the chance to interview. I said she'd been a private person, but she would have liked the question. Brooke appeared at my elbow. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were doing something they hadn't done before, recalculating. She said she almost didn't recognize me. She asked if I'd changed something. I said I was just wearing what I wore when I was being myself. She stared at me for a moment, opened her mouth, and then closed it again. I excused myself. Ryan found me near the window. He looked pale. He'd clearly heard the murmurs moving through the room, caught the new energy in how people were speaking to me. His voice was low when he asked what was going on. I told him nothing was going on. I told him I was just attending the brunch his mother had planned. He said it wasn't like that. He said we should talk. I said we would. Later. First, his mother was about to say something. Diana had positioned herself near the front of the room with the practiced authority of a woman who had hosted hundreds of these moments. She began by thanking everyone for coming. She spoke about the Caldwell legacy, about her family's commitment to excellence, about the future they were building. Her eyes found Ryan across the room, and she smiled her frozen smile, and she began to invite him to join her. That was when I walked to the center of the room instead. Not toward Diana, just to where I could be seen clearly, where my voice would carry. I said I wanted to thank Diana for inviting me into their home this weekend. The room quieted faster than she expected. I said that when Ryan first told me about this visit, I'd made a quiet decision. I'd decided to come exactly as the woman his family already assumed I was. Someone without impressive credentials. Someone with a modest car and drugstore sandals and no obvious social value. Diana's smile became very still. I said I had learned a lot this weekend. I described the lunch on the terrace, where my background had been measured and found lacking. I described the suggestion that I ought to feel grateful for being included. I described being compared, repeatedly and deliberately, to a woman I'd never met, whose primary qualification seemed to be that her family had money the Caldwells needed. Someone near the back said quietly, "Oh." I said I'd also learned some things I hadn't been meant to learn. I described the conversation in the hallway, almost word for word, because I have a clinical memory and I don't forget things people say when they think they're safe. I described being called a golden retriever someone let inside. I described the plan to manufacture a reason to end things with me once the Holt deal was secured. Brooke said that was a lie. Her voice cracked slightly on the word. I turned to face her. I asked if she'd like me to repeat the exact wording. I had good recall, I said. It was something that came in handy in emergency medicine. The room absorbed this. Several heads turned. The journalist near the window had gone very still. Diana took a step toward me. She said I was making serious accusations with no proof. She said I was clearly hurt and looking for a way to create drama. She said this was exactly the kind of reaction one expected from someone who... I said I also wanted to mention the Caldwell Hotels Group's financial position. Gerald sat down. I said I hadn't needed to dig very far. Public filings were public. Creditor notices were on record. The Miami irregularities had been flagged in a county report that anyone could access. I said I understood that the arrangement with the Holt family was the intended solution, and I understood that Ryan had agreed to maintain his connection with Cassandra as part of that arrangement. I took my phone from my pocket and showed the screen to the room. Not to humiliate, just to confirm. The message preview, the name, the timestamp. Ryan made a sound that wasn't quite words. Edward stepped forward from the window. He said he had something to add, and the room gave him the floor the way rooms give the floor to people who have been quietly waiting a long time. He produced a folder. He addressed Gerald directly, without ceremony. He said he'd been waiting 15 years for the right context. He said the Caldwells had a pattern, and the people in that room who did business with them deserved to know it. He set the folder on the table near the journalist. The Holt's attorney picked up his phone. I looked at Ryan. He was standing in the middle of his family's carefully constructed world, holding a ring he'd been planning to give me at this brunch. I could see it now. The small box he'd been moving from pocket to pocket all morning, thinking I hadn't noticed. He looked like someone who'd built a house of cards and had just watched someone open a window. He said my name. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said his family had pressured him, that he'd never intended for it to go this far, that what he felt for me was real. I believed the last part, actually. I didn't think it changed anything. I said I had given him several opportunities to tell me the truth. The evening before, when I'd asked directly if there was anything he wanted to say, the conversation where I'd mentioned Cassandra's name and watched him go pale and recover, he had chosen, each time, to say nothing. I said a person who couldn't be honest with the woman he claimed to love wasn't a person I was going to build a life with. I reached into my bag and set his ring box on the table between us. I hadn't been wearing it. I'd noticed the stone was cloudy, the setting slightly crooked, beautiful in low light. I'd made note of it on day one. Diana told me I had no right to come into her home and do this. Her voice was shaking now in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with control slipping. I told her, calmly, that I'd come into her home by invitation, that everything I'd shared was documented and verifiable, and that the reason I hadn't simply walked away the moment I heard that hallway conversation was that I believed the people in that room, the business partners, the colleagues, the friends who had been operating with incomplete information deserved to make their decisions with full knowledge. I looked at her directly. I said my grandmother taught me that the people who treat others as disposable always assume no one is paying attention. She said the biggest miscalculation a person can make is assuming the woman they've underestimated has no memory and no resources. I said I hoped they found a way forward that didn't involve using people as financial instruments. Then I picked up my bag, thanked Gerald for the hospitality, and walked out. The air outside was cool and smelled like the lake. I stood on the gravel drive for a moment, breathing it in. I could hear the sound of the gathering shifting behind the glass doors, voices rising, chairs moving, the particular sound of a room in which something irrevocable has just occurred. Edward came out 5 minutes later. He said the Holt's attorney had left. He said the journalist was asking questions. He said Gerald looked like a man who had finally run out of road. I asked if he felt settled. He thought about it. He said he felt something closer to finished, like a chapter closing that had been dragged on far too long. I told him I was glad he'd been there. He said my grandmother would have handled it exactly the same way, maybe even more quietly. I drove back to the city with my windows down. I didn't call anyone. I didn't replay the morning. I just drove and let the distance accumulate between me and that house on the lake and thought about the things I knew now that I hadn't known 11 months ago. I knew that Ryan was capable of a specific kind of cowardice, not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind that smiles warmly while never once standing in the gap. I knew that Diana Caldwell would keep doing what she'd always done, because people like that don't change from a single exposure. But they are deterred, and deterrence has its own kind of value. I knew that my grandmother had been right about the things she'd written in that letter. Character doesn't reveal itself under pressure. It reveals itself in the small, unguarded moments when someone believes the stakes are low. The lunch on the terrace, the walk to the dock, the hallway conversation no one thought I would hear. The Caldwells had believed the stakes were low with me. That was their error. 3 weeks later, I was eating breakfast in my condo, my real condo, the one with the skyline view and the organized bookshelves and the good coffee maker, when an alert came through about the Caldwell Hotels Group. A voluntary restructuring announcement. The Miami property was being sold. The Connecticut estate had been listed. The piece was short, factual, and quoted no family members. I finished my coffee. My phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. He said he knew he didn't deserve a response. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he'd realized that the version of himself his family had raised him to be was someone he didn't want to be anymore. He asked if there was any chance we could talk. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the table, stood up, and went to get ready for my shift. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed, not out of bitterness, not out of cruelty, but because the version of the future behind that door was never real to begin with, and the future in front of you is wide open. I put my grandmother's pearls in my coat pocket before I left that morning, the way I always do before a long shift, not as jewelry, just as a reminder of a woman who never needed anyone to know what she was worth, because she already knew. That, she always said, is the only kind of wealth that compounds without limit.